What's up everybody, welcome to my first official chess video. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to teach you one opening for white and two openings for black that are really good for the beginner to intermediate level that you can start employing in your games immediately to help you improve in chess and win more games. So what gave me the idea to do this video was a few days ago I was visiting Vermont and I was playing some games of chess with my cousin Nathaniel, and he was having trouble remembering openings that he had learned in the past because he had stopped playing chess for a couple of months. And so obviously since he doesn't remember any openings, he's having to make random moves to begin with, which is obviously a huge disadvantage to him because he doesn't have a good set plan that he's going toward. Some of his pieces are not going to be on the optimal squares, and there's a plethora of other issues that come along with just playing random moves. And I was thinking, this cracker's rated 1100 and he doesn't know any openings. How the heck is this a thing? So I was thinking, if there's somebody who's rated 1100 who doesn't even know the most basic openings, there's probably a lot of other people who are in the same situation as him, and maybe I can make a video to help them out. So then I told that cracker, alright, you know what, you just gave me an idea for my first chess video, thank you, and I'm gonna whoop you up some chess. Although I did end up losing one game because I was completely losing my mind. It was an absolute nightmare. Really embarrassing because it's a huge rating disparity. He's 1100, I'm 1800, and I got absolutely slapped. Just like straight up blundered to rook. It was retarded. Probably not supposed to say retarded anymore, but nobody's gonna watch this stuff anyway, so for now I can kind of say what I want. So I guess I'm going to explain why it's important to learn openings in chess. So the reason why learning openings is so fundamental to improving in chess is because openings teach you the optimal squares to develop your pieces, it teaches you basic strategy, it teaches you king safety, it helps you move quickly in the beginning of the game because obviously you have a set strategy before you begin, and there's a plethora of other advantages to knowing openings, so that's why I'm teaching you these. We're going to start with an opening for white, and I'm only teaching one opening for white because you're the one who has the initiative when you're playing with white, you're the one who makes the first move, so you're kind of setting the pace of the game, so you really only need to know one opening for white at a lower level, it doesn't really matter. The opening I'm going to start with for white is going to be the most infamous, the most ubiquitous, and one of the most played openings in chess. It's kind of the opening that struck chess into stardom a few years ago, and it is the Queen's Gambit. And Queen's Gambit is a Queen's Pawn opening, hence the name, so it's going to start with the move d4. And then right after d4 is going to be followed by your opponent playing d5. So a gambit in chess is you're sacrificing some form of material, which is typically a pawn, for some type of positional advantage, some type of piece activity, or some type of attack, or something along those lines. So you're sacrificing material for some positional advantage, essentially. The gambit in this opening is after d5 is played, you are going to play this move c4. And now for lower level players who don't really understand the idea of gambits, you'd be like, what the frick is this crap? You just straight up threw away a pawn for absolutely no reason. And to the untrained eye, it does look like that, because this pawn can just simply be captured. However, if you understand some of the basic strategy of chess, you realize why you did that. So one really important thing in chess is to control the center. The center has really important squares because it kind of inhibits your opponent's ability to develop their pieces, it helps facilitate the development of your own pieces, and it helps you control really important squares in the game. So in this instance, if your opponent ends up taking your pawn, what they just did is they just traded a central pawn for one of the pawns to the side, one of the less valuable pawns. Central pawns are always the most valuable, and then flank pawns obviously are the least valuable. So you may ask the question, is a center worth more than a pawn? I would say no, however, the Queen's Gambit isn't a true gambit because holding onto the pawn that they just won is pretty much impossible. So you may ask the question, how is it so hard to hold on to this pawn? It's because you have so many developing moves that are going to put so much pressure on this pawn, and if your opponent tries to hold on to this pawn too hard, they can end up completely destroying their position and losing the game immediately. So I'm going to show you a really nice trap to begin with, and this is called the Queen's Gambit accepted variation. So to do a quick recap and help you retain all these steps that we just went through, this opening that we just played is it started with d4, d5, then the Gambit, Queen's Gambit, c4, and then for the Queen's Gambit accepted, your opponent with their pawn on d5 takes your pawn on c4. So to proceed, what we're going to do is try to set up a little trap. Now this is a trap that has helped me win dozens and dozens of games. Even at a high level, people still fall for this trap. You remember how I said earlier that it's really hard to hold on to this pawn? You're about to see why. So after your opponent captures your pawn on c4, what you're going to do is you're going to play this quiet move e3. So when you're playing chess, what you guys are essentially doing is you're arguing with each other. You're saying, you're stupid, no, you're stupid because I can do this, and no, you're stupid because I can do this, and I can do this, blah, blah, blah. And then whoever is making the better argument is obviously going to win the game. So the argument that I'm making right now is, hey, that stupid pawn that you just won, guess what? You're not going to hold on to that because now I just opened up a square for developing my bishop, and I'm attacking your pawn. How are you going to hold on to that pawn, fool? So your opponent can think that they're very clever, and they're like, I can hold on to this pawn very easily. Watch this bozo. And then they play, boom, b5. So if you don't know this trick that I'm about to teach you, you may think, oh dude, that was a really good argument with this guy. He's now going to support this pawn. I'm sure I have better control of the center, but he's just up a pawn. He clearly has the advantage. But now here's your argument right here. Big b5, huh? I'm going to undermine the support that you just established for that pawn by playing the move a4. So now you are attacking their pawn chain, threatening the capture of that pawn on b5, which then leaves that pawn on c4 completely vulnerable to capture with a tempo because you're developing a piece while capturing something. So your opponent will typically do is think, okay, you're attacking my pawn chain. What I need to do is solidify the positioning of my pawn chain by pushing another pawn to protect the pawn that was just put under attack. So lower level, what you usually see is this move a6. This move is kind of dumb because it's kind of creating the illusion of protecting this pawn, but this pawn isn't really protected because what you just did was establish a pin. So what I mean by that is if you capture this pawn and then they try to retain their pawn chain, oopsie, black's losing the game. So in this instance, you can simply recapture, and in most instances, you're just going to be up a pawn depending on what your opponent plays, because you're threatening to take this pawn, and then obviously we already established that they can't recapture. So typically what you'll do is you'll take this pawn, and then you'll end up taking this pawn later with your bishop, with the tempo, and then you just have a very comfortable position. So rather than playing that move a6, your opponent decides to play c6. This way they're also protecting their pawn chain. However, this move also kind of loses on the spot and puts the rook in danger just in a different way. So if your opponent plays this move c6, what you're going to do is a very simple move, is you're going to capture this pawn over on b5. And then almost every single time you're going to see your opponent recapture. And then you're going to play the seemingly innocuous move queen to f3. And then all of a sudden, oopsie, there's no way to defend the rook. You're just going to win this rook. They try to defend their bishop, you just take the bishop. If they try to develop their knight to block, you just take. If they try to block the queen, you just take the queen. So there's no way to defend this rook, so you're just going up a piece immediately off the bat because of this opening trap. And so now that you know that trap, you can go through and watch that part of the video a couple times if you need help memorizing all of the moves. It's very simple. I've won dozens of games doing this. This will come up in a lot of your games, so it's really good to know. So two other things that you're really going to need to know if you're playing the Queen's Gambit is you're going to need to know the Queen's Gambit decline, and you're going to need to know the Slav defense. So obviously, there's a bunch of different stuff that you can do in chess. Your opponent's not always going to do what you want, and what you want when you're going into the Queen's Gambit is to always go into what's called the old variation of the Queen's Gambit accepted. Because typically that's the easiest way to get an advantage for white. Typically when you're playing the Queen's Gambit, you're going to play against this infamous opening, the Queen's Gambit declined. So where the Queen's Gambit decline comes from is you're going to play move d4 obviously, d5, c4. Instead of capturing and going into the Queen's Gambit accepted, what your opponent's going to do is play this move e6, and this is called the Queen's Gambit decline. This is one of the most infamous openings in chess, and this is kind of like the big counter to the Queen's Gambit. So when you run into the Queen's Gambit decline, no need to get worried. You can still get an advantage very easily, or you can just obtain a very comfortable position. So I don't really know any cool traps for this, so for this I just like to do very basic, normal developing moves and try to get a comfortable position, and hopefully try to set up an attack later down the road. So after you're seeing this move c6, what you're going to want to do is move your knight out to c3. This puts the knight on an excellent square, you're putting more pressure on their center, and if they end up recapturing later on anyways, it doesn't really matter because you still have that tactic that I showed you earlier where you just bring your pawn out to e3 and then you develop your bishop with the tempo. And then holding on to the pawn, obviously as I showed earlier, very problematic, very difficult to do. What your opponent's most likely going to do is just give you a big advantage rather than actually end up holding onto that pawn. So after you play your knight out to c3, what you're typically going to see is your opponent is going to play knight f6. Yeah, you're typically going to see this move knight f6, and I know there's this thing in chess, an opening principle where knights before bishops, but in this instance, I actually like to bring the bishop out first because I like to pin that knight. So when I see the knight come out to f6, I automatically bring my bishop out here to g5 and end up pinning that knight. I can end up bringing their bishop out later to break the pin. It's really no big deal because you're just going to end up exchanging bishops and you still have a completely even position and you're going to have a good game to play. You end up bringing your bishop out here to b5, and then typically you're going to see your opponent break the pin like this with bishop e7. After seeing bishop e7, then you are going to go on to the plan of developing your knights, and you're going to bring your knight out to f3. Then after this, typically you're going to see your opponent play this move knight c6. After seeing knight c6, you're going to be very familiar with this next move because it's the exact same move that you saw earlier when I was showing you that opening trap, and you were going to play pawn e3. And then typically after pawn e3, what you're going to see is your opponent play this move out here, bishop d7. And right here, what you're going to see right here is, in the computer agrees with me, is you already have a pretty sizable advantage considering that we're still in the opening phase of the game of almost an entire pawn because of your position. And the reason why you're doing so well is because, well, first of all, you have a lot of pressure placed on the center, and your pieces are kind of inactive. You see how the bishops are all stuck on d7 and e7? It's a very passive position, and you don't want to have passivity in chess. You want to have attacking chances because defending is much harder than attacking. Make a mistake in attacking, generally you're not going to lose the game unless you plunder your piece because all the pieces are surrounded the enemy king, and so your king is not as under fire, and so you're not being threatened with a bunch of checkmates, etc. You are going to play the very active move, bishop out to d3, and so your bishop is going to be eyeing this long diagonal, and you want to place your bishops on long diagonals when you can because that's where bishops are the best. The bishops are snipers. They are super sniper monster bishops. That's what you want to create every single time you go into a chess game. So you want to put your bishop on the longest diagonal possible where it has the most possible targets. So the computer is disagreeing with me and telling me that this lost a little bit of the advantage, but nobody cares what the computer has to say. This is my opening video, so I'm going to tell you what I like to play. And so then typically you're just going to play a normal game from here. I'm not going to show you anything too complex. I don't want you to know too much theory, but you'll just see castles, and then you'll generally see the game continue with either you capturing right here, and your opponent recaptures, and now they have an isolated pawn, which obviously is problematic in any endgame that you play. And you also have this idea at some point when you're doing this opening is you want to bring your queen out here to c2, and that way you're creating this battering ram down here attacking this pawn, and so you could capture this knight right here and then capture the pawn with check, and then boom, you open up your opponent's king a little bit, and then you win a pawn. So that's what you need to know for the Queen's Gambit decline, and now I'm going to get into the Slav defense a little bit, but it's pretty much going to have the exact same idea, so this is going to be really easy for you to memorize. So for the Slav defense, you simply continue with the Queen's Gambit, so d4, d5, c4, and then instead of playing that move e6, what your opponent plays is this pawn out here to c6, also solidifying the center. And for this, you're going to have the exact same plan as before. You're going to bring knight out to c6, you're going to bring this knight out to f3, you're going to typically bring this bishop out to pin the knight, or you're going to put the bishop over here on f4 where it's targeting that long diagonal. You're going to bring your pawn out to either e4 or e3, depending on the position. You're going to bring your bishop out here, and then you're going to have a very comfortable game. And it's basically going to be the exact same idea as when you're playing against the Queen's Gambit declined. Now here's the fun part. I'm going to teach you two openings for this. I'm going to start with an opening to play against d4. So when your opponent plays d4, the opening that I would recommend, just because you don't really need to memorize anything, this is kind of a brain-dead opening, although you want to think a little bit because it's chess, because you don't want to blunder any pieces or any forks or anything along those lines. But I'm going to teach you the Pirch defense or the King's Indian defense. It depends on what your opponent plays. It's pretty much the exact same opening either way, but one opening is played when the opponent puts 3 pawns in the center, and that's the King's Indian, and the other one's called the Pirch defense. But it's kind of pedantic, the fact that they even have different names, because it's the exact same setup. It's just against different setups for white. So for the King's Indian defense, I'm just going to call it the King's Indian defense, even if it transposes into the Pirch defense, just for simplicity's sake. So for the King's Indian defense, after your opponent plays pawn to d4, what you're going to play is this move, knight f6. So the general idea of the King's Indian defense is you're going to bring your pieces out, and you're going to utilize your pieces to kind of stake a claim in the center and to attack your opponent's center, and then you're going to then utilize that to then launch an attack in the center. So anytime you are learning an opening, you want to learn the themes, you want to learn the ideas of the opening, you want to learn the logic behind what you're doing, and that will help you apply what you're learning in the opening to other scenarios in your chess games. Now that you know the general idea of the King's Indian defense, I'm going to show you some more of the moves. So typically after playing this move, pawn to d4, and after you play knight f6, you make no claim in the center to begin with. What your opponent will do, especially at an intermediate level, is they will do the very principled thing, is they will take the full center. So they will play this move, pawn to e4. They now have the full center. And so what's really important to know when you're playing the King's Indian defense is you don't want to have this knight kicked out, because obviously now they're threatening to play this move, pawn to e5. They're taking a lot of space, and they're also forcing your knight back to its starting square, which is just a waste of the tempo, and you're basically losing if you allow that to happen. So what you need to do to counter that is play this very important move, pawn to d6. So now you meet e5 with the pawn on d6, and you can recapture. So the reason why you play this pawn out to d6 and why this is so fundamental is this big move e5 that they push is now met with that pawn on d6, and then you can utilize that pawn to capture. And if they recapture, they're now threatening to take your knight. But you now have this good intermediate move to play, is you can capture their queen with check. And then now you have a nice advantage in this position, because now they have to recapture with their king. Now their king is stuck in the center, and now you're in a very comfortable position. And then you can just bring your knight out here, saving the knight, attacking this pawn in the center. You're threatening a fork, and you just have an excellent position here. And then you'll just completely follow up with normal moves. You'll bring your pawn out here, you'll bring the bishops out, you'll bring your knight out, and then you're probably going to be in a very good spot in this game. So to show you a more normal King's Indian defense, if they're not playing super aggressively like that, just to show you where all the pieces belong, say your opponent plays d4, you're going to obviously play the move knight f6 as discussed earlier, and say if your opponent plays e4, remember after e4 in the King's Indian defense, you always play d6. Every single circumstance you play d6, and then say your opponent, instead of playing super aggressively, they start playing normal developing moves, say they bring their knight out to c3. What your goal now is to fianchetto your bishop on the kingside castle, and then develop the rest of your pieces normally. So after this move knight c3, you are going to meet that with this move g6, and so your goal is to do exactly what I just said, bishop out to g7, kingside castle, and then you're going to bring the rest of your pieces out. So it'll look something like this. Say they play that move, I play g6, they bring the knight out to f3, g7, they play bishop out here, castles, and so then what your next few moves are going to be is probably going to bring your bishop out here to g4, hitting that knight, and then you're going to just try and trade this bishop off, preferably for the bishop, but if you have to trade it for the knight, that's completely fine. And then you're going to want to bring this knight out to d7, defending this knight, supporting it, and you're just going to have a very comfortable position. So say they castle, bishop out here, and say they play out here. You see this very common because then they have a pin on the knight if you then end up moving this pawn later down the road. So you're going to play this move, and then say they just play some boring move like this. You're just in a completely fine position. So you're just in a very comfortable position here. You can trade the bishop for the knight. Typically, you don't want to give away a bishop for a knight unless you absolutely have to. But what I like to do in this position, I like to try and build up and push for c5 down the road to then kind of attack their center and get a nice aggressive attacking game set up. So this is pretty much a general setup for the King's Indian defense. You can play this against many different move orders. This is going to be something you'll be able to deploy over and over again. You just have to watch out and make sure you're not going to blunder any pieces. So you always want to make sure you're paying attention to what your opponent's doing. But this is a setup that you can get in many games. And so now we're going to move on to an opening to play against e4. So I'm going to put e4 out on the board. And what this opening is called is it's the French defense. And so the French defense starts with this move e6. So upon first glance, this opening doesn't really make any sense, because why not just move the pawn out to e5? You're staking a claim in the center, you're still opening this bishop up, etc. What is the argument here? So what you're trying to do with the French defense is you're trying to immediately start attacking your opponent's center. So typically after you play that move e6, you'll see your opponent play d4, claiming the full center, and at an intermediate level, and sometimes at a beginner level, you are going to typically see your opponent taking the full center whenever they can, because they watch YouTubers who tell them that's good, and it is good, the computer likes it, so you do it. We obey the computer. Unless the computer's being an idiot, then we don't listen to it. And so after your opponent plays d4, claiming the full center, you're going to do exactly what I said earlier, is you're going to attack your opponent's center. And so the way that you're going to do that is this move d5, hitting this pawn over on e4. So there's two different variations I'm going to cover in this video. I'm going to cover the advanced version of the French defense, and I'm going to cover the exchange version of the French defense. There's a million other variations of this that people play. However, according to the database, these are the most common ones played, and so these are the ones you're most likely going to see in your games the vast majority of the time. So I'm going to start with the exchange version of the French defense, which, as stated in the name, is when you exchange the pawns. So you're going to now attack their center, and so what they're going to do is they're going to take the pawn that you just placed down on d5, and then you're going to recapture with your pawn, and so now you're in a completely symmetrical position. In chess, what you need to do is just don't go crazy. So we're going to just do normal developing moves. So after we do this exchange, typically you'll see your opponent play something simple like knight f3. You're going to follow up by playing knight f6. Your opponent often will try to put their bishop on an active diagonal, so they'll bring the bishop out here to d3, and then what you're going to do is you're going to do the exact same thing. You're going to bring your bishop out to d6, putting it on an active diagonal, and then your opponent's going to castle. And right now it's really important that you castle as well, because otherwise they're going to be harassing your king with checks and stuff like that. So you're going to castle, and then your opponent will continue with normal moves. So something that's very common that you'll see is somebody will want to solidify their center and support their central pawn. So you see this move, pawn to c3. And they're going to play pawn to c3 with the idea of bringing their bishop out here to pin your knight, and then they're going to want to bring their other knight out here to d2, where they're supporting their other knight, and their knight's just on a flying square. It's kind of passive, but they have the ability to reroute it later if they need to. So what you're going to do now is you're going to play what's called a prophylactic move in chess, which essentially means that you're playing a move in anticipation of another move that's going to be made by your opponent. So what you're going to do is you're going to make this move pawn h6. So the point of this move is you are preventing your opponent from bringing their bishop out to g5, pinning your knight to your queen, and it kind of just allows the mobility of your knight, allows the mobility of your queen, and pins are just kind of annoying, so you want to avoid those when you can. So let's say if your opponent does something like they want to take the open file for the rook, so they're going to bring the rook out to e1 here. Fine. So what you're going to do is you're going to follow that up by kind of capitalizing on the mistake that your opponent made, and you're going to bring your bishop out here to c4. And so now you're having that annoying pin that you just stopped your opponent from having. This isn't claiming some crazy advantage, but especially at a beginner level, you will see your opponents blundering their queen all the time because of this pin. They just will lose their minds and absolutely throw everything away. So in most instances, your opponent will likely continue to play completely normal and rational moves, and so maybe they'll bring their bishop out here. It's kind of a passive square, but they don't really have anywhere else good to bring it, because they bring it out here, you just capture it. Obviously they can't bring it out here. They could try and fianchetto later down the road and just play this move, bishop b2, but that's going to be less common. What they're trying to do is just get their bishop out, and they're going to bring their knight out. So what you're going to do right here is you're going to bring your knight out to d7, and then your opponent is going to finish the development by bringing the knight out to d2. And then this is pretty much the opening. This is the exchange variation, and you just play normal chess from here. There's more theory I could teach you, but this is pretty much as far as it's going to go. This is a very normal position. This is a very balanced position, so just don't lose your mind and play normal chess here. So this right here is the normal French defense, and the next variation, the French defense that I'm going to cover, is the advanced variation. So what the advanced variation simply means is they're advancing their pawn, hence the name. So what they're going to do is they're going to push this pawn out here to e5, and now they have a very nice center. They kind of have a lot of stake claimed inside of your territory, and this pawn is kind of just a nuisance. So what you want to do in this scenario, the plan that you have, the idea is you want to try and destabilize these pawns. And the way that you do that is you start by chipping away at their pawn chain, and you always want to be thinking about pawn chains. If you can chip away at a pawn chain, you should. In most instances, you're going to play this move c5. So what this move c5 does is you are attacking this pawn, you are attacking the most important part of the pawn chain, and you are not really too worried about them recapturing this pawn, because if they recapture, you are simply just going to recapture it with tempo. You have an excellent position here. This pawn is now super weak, because when you're playing moves like knight c6, you are going to be attacking that pawn, and you just have a really good time here. So after playing pawn to c5, seldom will your opponent take this. Maybe at a lower level your opponent will be taking this pawn, but in most instances, you're just going to see your opponent very simply solidify their pawn chain by playing this move, pawn to c3. After you see pawn to c3, typically the move that you will want to play here is knight to c6, and you're just trying to build up more and more pressure. You're trying to take this pawn and take away this pawn chain, you're trying to destabilize it, and that's what you're trying to do, just apply pressure. Typically after this, your opponent will play this move out here. You will play this move bishop to b5, pinning this knight, because that knight is really important in applying pressure to their pawn chain right now, and they want to stop that. So typically after seeing this move bishop to b5, what I like to do here is I like to break this pin that they just established on the knight, because the knight is currently pinned to the king, and I like to play this move bishop d7, breaking the pin, and then allowing that knight to continue applying pressure. And then typically after this, your opponent will either capture the knight, or they will just leave the tension and they will play knight f3, and you're just going to continue with normal developer moves. So let's go and walk through a scenario where they play knight to f3. So they bring their knight out to f3, and what you're going to have to do is this little bit of a maneuver here. And so you're going to have to bring your knight out here to e7 first, because obviously you can't bring it out to f6 because you're just going to lose it immediately. And so your opponent often will try and do this stupid move where they'll bring their bishop out here to g5, pinning it. If they do that, you're really not worried about that because you get to bring your queen out here to b6, hitting this bishop, and then also kind of x-raying this pawn right here. They just move the bishop and take. You can recapture, and then you're immediately hitting this pawn. Your queen's active. You're threatening to take this and then put more pressure on their center. So you just have a really comfortable position here. And then obviously if they just capture here, you recapture the bishop, and then you have a very comfortable position. You have the bishop pair, and you're doing very well here. You're just going to castle your king. They're going to castle, and then you're going to have a game. So that's kind of all the theory that you need to know for these 3 openings I just taught you. I hope you find this video useful. I hope you're able to employ this stuff in your games, and I hope it helps you win a couple more games, and I hope you enjoyed the video. It's been a pleasure making this video. All you have a good day. Bye-bye.